What would you do if everything you owned fit inside a single canvas satchel, and the only thing of any real worth in it was a tool that had belonged to a dead man? We ask you that tonight because we think you'll understand the way some things resist being valued in dollars, the way they carry a weight that money never could. Settle in, wherever you are across this country, because this is the story of a young woman named Dinah Colbrook, and what she found when she paid $12 for a ruin that everyone else in Grey County had long since written off. The autumn of 1889 arrived hard in that part of Ontario. The maples went from green to copper almost overnight, and the wind coming off the limestone ridges carried the smell of ice long before it had any right to. Dinah walked the wagon road north, out of the village of Elgin, with her coat buttoned to the throat, and one hand pressed against her pocket, feeling the smooth, familiar weight of an old bone folder that had belonged to Joseph Renwick, bookbinder, the man who had taught her everything that mattered. Joseph Renwick had been a small, patient man who smelled of hide glue and linseed oil and the particular warm dustiness of old paper. He had taken Dinah on as an apprentice when she was 14. A year after her mother's long illness finally ended, and the village had nothing left to offer a girl with no family and no prospects. In his bindery, she learned to read paper the way a carpenter reads grain in wood. With her fingertips, with instinct, with a kind of respect that couldn't be rushed. She learned to sew signatures and press spines, and recognize a government seal from 30 feet away by the weight and color of the wax. Renwick had pressed that bone folder into her hand 6 months before he died, when his own hands had grown too stiff to hold it. "Keep it," he'd said. "It will tell you when a thing is worth saving." He died in March. By April, his nephew, a man who had driven up from Hamilton in a fine new coat and had never once set foot in the bindery while Renwick was alive, informed Dinah that the property was being sold and her room above the shop was needed for the transaction. She had until the end of the week. She packed everything into the canvas satchel. She kept the bone folder in her coat pocket. She left before the nephew returned. She had $12.35, the sum total of her wages from the last season, which she had not spent because she had nowhere to spend them and no one to spend with. $12, a bone folder, and a craft that had no workshop to practice it in. She was 20 years old, and she walked north because the road went north, and because standing still felt like agreeing to disappear. She walked for 3 days, following the post road toward the market town of Harwick. The name meant nothing to her. She was simply moving in the direction of other people, toward the distant possibility of something she couldn't yet name. She arrived on a Thursday, which happened to be the day of the county tax sale. The square in front of the Harwick Town Hall was crowded in the particular way that misfortune draws a crowd, not with sympathy, but with the careful, comfortable interest of people watching someone else's difficulty from a safe distance. The auctioneer, a red-faced man in a checked coat, stood on an upturned crate and read from his list of delinquent properties with the cheerful efficiency of a man who felt nothing about any of it and saw no reason he should. A foreclosed woodlot sold quickly. A failed market garden went for next to nothing. A pair of draft horses drew some spirited bidding from the men at the front. Then the auctioneer shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, and announced Lot 11. The former Fenchurch Grist mill, Barrow Creek Road, together with the mill house, the stone outbuilding, and 8 acres of creek frontage. Delinquent in county taxes for 11 years. Starting bid, $20. Silence. He tried again. $15. A solid stone building, ladies and gentlemen. Good bones, harness the creek if you've a mind to. Someone near the front made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close enough to one. A woman beside Dinah murmured to her companion that the Fenchurch mill hadn't turned a wheel in a decade, that the mill race had silted up in a flood, that the north end of the roof had caved in, and there was a family of raccoons living in the loft. Her companion nodded, already losing interest. $12, said the auctioneer, with the tone of a man surrendering to an inevitability. Dinah's hand went up before she had decided to lift it. The crowd turned. She saw it happen in sequence, head by head, like a stand of wheat moving in wind, all those faces swiveling toward the thin young woman at the back with the travel-worn coat and the serious eyes. $12, said Dinah. Her voice was steadier than she felt. The auctioneer stared at her for a long, unreadable moment. Going once, he said, in a tone that suggested he half expected someone to rescue both of them from this situation. Going twice. No one spoke. Sold, he said to the young lady, for $12. The deed was a single folded sheet with the county seal pressed into the paper, the ink faded to gray-brown at the edges. Dinah held it and thought of Renwick's words about knowing when a thing was worth saving. She was not at all certain she had just done that. But somewhere in the square, she noticed a large, prosperous-looking man in a good wool coat, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, not amusement, something sharper than amusement. He held her gaze for one moment, then turned and walked away. She would learn his name soon enough. What did she think she'd find inside an 11-year abandoned mill? We're going to let you sit with that question for a moment, because the answer was more complicated than anyone in Harwick expected. Tell us in the comments. What would you have guessed? The road to the Fenchurch mill was hardly a road at all. Two-wheel ruts pressed into the clay of the hillside, half grown over with goldenrod and wild aster. Dinah made the 4-mile walk in the gray mid-afternoon, her satchel over one shoulder, the deed in her coat pocket beside the bone folder. The mill sat at the bottom of a shallow valley where Barrow Creek made a wide bend through the limestone. It was built of the same gray stone as the ridge above, thick walls, small deep-set windows made by people who intended to stay. But the north end of the main building had indeed fallen. A section of roof lay crumpled inward, and the timber beneath it had rotted black. The mill race was choked solid, with silt and river willow, and the great wooden wheel had shed most of its paddles and listed sideways on its iron axle, like something half-defeated and unwilling to admit it. Across the overgrown gravel yard, separated from the mill by 20 feet, stood a second, smaller building. Also stone, also old, but different from the mill, in a way that took a moment to understand. It was whole, its roof was intact, its door was shut, and unlike the mill, which sagged and whispered of years, this building had a solidness to it that was more felt than seen. A quality of intention, as though it had been built to hold something specific and had been doing so ever since. Dinah did not approach it that evening. She was too tired, too cold, too occupied with the immediate problem of shelter. She found a corner of the mill, where the walls were sound and a section of remaining roof was tight, laid her coat over herself, and slept with the bone folder pressed in her hand. She dreamed of Renwick's bindery, of the smell of glue warming on the stove, of his voice saying that a well-made thing resists. In the morning, she got to work. There is a particular kind of comfort in hard physical labor when the mind is carrying grief. Dinah found it that first full day at the Fenchurch mill, hauling fallen timber out of the main room, stacking usable stone in one pile and ruined timber in another, assessing what could be rebuilt and what was already past saving. Renwick had trained patience into her hands. The understanding that careful attention applied to broken things is never wasted effort. She brought that patience to the mill, and the mill slowly began to respond. She worked alone for 8 days, sleeping in her dry corner, eating the last of what she'd brought and supplementing it with wild apples from a gnarled tree at the creek's edge. She was cold and hungry and more purposeful than she had felt since March. On the 9th day, a man arrived with a wagon. He was perhaps 35, lean and weathered in the particular way of men who work outdoors through Ontario winters, with the unhurried quiet of someone accustomed to working without an audience. He introduced himself as Reed Maddock, millwright, and said he had heard from the harness maker in Harwick that someone had bought the Fenchurch place. He did not ask what she planned to do with it. He looked at the fallen roof, at the mill race, at the wheel, and said that the iron axle was probably still sound, that the mill race could be cleared in a week with the right tools, that the north wall could be rebuilt if she used lime mortar rather than the clay and sand mix that had failed. He said all of this without any suggestion that it was his place to say it, and without any expectation that she would take the advice. He had some salvaged lumber in the wagon. He'd brought it on the chance it might be useful. He set it in the yard and prepared to leave. Dinah asked him to stay. He did. They worked well together, which is rarer than most people suppose. Reed Maddock did not explain things twice, and did not speak when silence served better. He taught her how to seat a stone so the frost wouldn't heave it, how to read the silt lines in the mill race, to understand where the water moved and where it didn't, how to evaluate a timber for whether it still had years in it. In return, she offered it as information, not exchange. Dinah told him about bookbinding, about how a thing structure determined its longevity, about how a signature properly sewn could hold a book together for 300 years. He listened the way he did most things, without comment, but with attention. A dog arrived sometime in the second week, a brindle-colored hound of uncertain breed, lean and self-possessed, who appeared one morning at the edge of the mill yard and declined to leave despite receiving no particular encouragement. Dinah called him Burr for the way he collected every burr and seed head on the property. He followed her everywhere, into the mill, up to the creek, along the ridge path, everywhere, that is, except one place. He would not go near the stone outbuilding. Every morning he would trot to within 10 feet of the door, stop, lower his nose, and back away with his tail low. He did it the same way each time methodically, as though checking whether his assessment had changed and finding that it hadn't. Dinah had not gone near it either, which she would later be unable to entirely explain. The door itself was the thing, she thought. It was a heavy plank door with iron strap hinges, and it was not simply locked. A length of iron chain had been looped through a bracket and secured with a lock she recognized, a government customs lock. The kind she had seen on consignments of imported paper stock at the bindery, with the crown and gear stamp of the Department of the Interior pressed into the iron. She had noticed it on the first day and had not touched it since, telling herself she had other priorities. But really she had been turning the fact of it over in her mind, the way you turn a strange coin, looking for the side that makes sense. Reed Maddock crouched beside it one evening at dusk and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "That's not a mill lock," he said. "I've worked in mills all across Bruce and Gray County. That stamp is interior. They use those on bonded stores, inventory under federal protection, relief goods, survey materials, provisions the government was responsible for distributing." He stood up slowly, brushing the rust from his fingers. "Someone sealed this under federal authority. And then the mill sat on the tax rolls for 11 years, and no one came back for whatever is inside." Dinah stood in the failing light with the bone folder in her hand. She hadn't noticed she'd taken it out. She was turning it over in her fingers the way she always did when she was working something through. She said, "I need to know what's in there." Reed nodded once. He said, "I thought you might." They broke the bracket from the stone with a cold chisel the following morning, taking turns with the hammer in steady rhythm until the mortar let go and the chain fell. The lock itself had rusted to a single fused mass. It hadn't functioned for years. The door was the last obstacle, swollen in its frame and sealed by a decade of damp. They used a timber as a lever, both of them leaning their full weight into it, until the door gave with a shudder and a gust of stale cold air rushed out to meet them. The smell was grain dust and cedar, and something dry and sweet, like old canvas kept in a closed room. They brought the lantern inside. The room was full of crates, wooden crates in orderly rows from floor to rafter, each one stenciled in the same crown and gear of the Department of the Interior, and beneath it, Gray County homestead relief, grain and provision, autumn 1878. 11 years ago. Dinah took the crowbar to the nearest crate. Inside, packed in sawdust, were sealed tins of wheat seed, sound, dry, intact. Then oats, the next, salt pork in crocks sealed with waxen cloth caps that had held perfectly. A fourth crate held bolts of heavy wool flannel. A fifth held medicinal supplies, iodine, rolled bandage linen, a bottle of quinine sulfate still in its original wrapping. It was everything a family needed to survive a bad season. The kind of provision that, properly distributed in the autumn of 1878, could have kept a dozen households through the winter that followed. The one the old-timers in Harwick still called the Gray Winter, the season that had broken 3 farms on the Barrow Creek Road alone. Reed was at the back of the room. He had found a small iron strongbox on a shelf, its latch unlocked. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were a set of ledgers, thin, official-looking books with green linen covers that Dinah recognized immediately as government issue accounts. She knew that binding. She had worked with that same linen, bought from the same provincial supplier, in Renwick's shop for 6 years. She opened the top ledger with the care Renwick had taught her, supporting the spine, opening slowly, letting the pages lie flat without forcing them. Her eyes went to the first entry, then to the last page, then to the signature column, and stayed there. Every distribution line was blank. Column after column, page after page. Intended recipients listed by farm name. The Abbott family on the South Road, the Pros at the Creek Bend, the Garnett family at the north end of the concession. Every one of them with an empty space where a receipt acknowledgement should have been. The goods had never been given out. They had never left this room. And at the bottom of each page, in heavy copperplate ink, attesting that the distribution had been completed and all goods dispersed, was a single signature. Alderman Thaddeus Crisp, Gray County Homestead Relief Committee, October 1878. Dinah stood in the lantern light and understood all at once why the door had been sealed and why it had not been reopened. The Department of the Interior had logged the lock, the seal, the inventory, and the responsible signatory. To move the contents, Crisp would have had to account for them to the federal government. To destroy the ledgers, he would have had to explain their absence. He had calculated correctly that an abandoned mill on a delinquent tax roll was safer than any action he could take. He had waited for the building to rot and the documents to decay. He had very nearly been right. She closed the oilcloth carefully over the ledgers, tucked them under her arm, and walked out into the autumn morning. Word travels in a small county the way water travels downhill, finding every gap, moving without permission. The first thing Dinah gave away was a bolt of the wool flannel, handed to a boy she found checking a rabbit snare along the mill race, wearing a coat 2 sizes too small for him. The boy was the youngest of the Garnett family, whose name appeared in the ledger with 11 years of blank space beside it. He took the flannel home. His mother, who had survived the gray winter on half rations and had never understood why the promised relief had never come, told her neighbors at Sunday service. Within the week, the story had reached Harwick. Alderman Thaddeus Crisp heard about it in his dry goods store on a Monday morning, and the color left his face. He arrived at the mill that same afternoon with 2 members of the town council and the municipal constable, a tired-looking man named Story, who appeared to have hoped this particular day would not come. Crisp himself was a large man who carried his authority forward, ahead of him, as a kind of prow. He stood in the mill yard and declared, in a voice built for courtrooms and public meetings, that the store goods were county property, that the outbuilding was not covered by any tax sale deed, and that Dinah Colbrook was a squatter and a thief who had tampered with property under the protection of the Crown. Reed Maddock was splitting wood at the side of the mill. He set his axe down, straightened, and stood there. He didn't speak. He didn't move toward anyone. But the quality of his stillness, the settled, deliberate stillness of a man who has decided exactly where he intends to remain, made the 2 councilmen look briefly at each other. Dinah came out of the mill, with the oilcloth bundle under her arm. These goods were sealed under federal authority in October of 1878, she said. She looked at Constable Story, not at Crisp. Her voice was level. She had thought carefully about what she intended to say, and she said it without decoration. The distribution ledger shows every intended recipient in this county. The dispersal columns are blank. The attestation signature on each page belongs to Alderman Crisp. I would like someone from the provincial government to explain the difference between those 2 facts. Crisp spoke about a flood, about mislaid provincial paperwork, about the administrative confusion of the relief period, how records had been lost all across the county, how no one could have anticipated. His voice had the particular quality of a man producing a story he has rehearsed but hoped never to need. Dinah started to respond. The weather interrupted them both. The sky had been building all morning, a low, dark architecture of cloud pressing in from the northwest, the kind that arrives without negotiation in the last weeks of October and can empty a foot of snow on the land in an afternoon. As Crisp was still speaking, the first hard gust swept the millyard, and the temperature dropped sharply. Snow began to fall, not tentatively, the way it sometimes begins, but all at once, as though it had been waiting and someone had finally given the signal. Crisp looked at the sky. He looked at his horses, already shifting against the wind. He looked at Dinah. I will return with a writ from the county magistrate, he said. Do not touch anything else in that building. He and his men mounted and turned toward Harwick and disappeared into the white. Constable Story was the last to go. He paused with his horse at the edge of the yard and looked at Dinah for a moment, not with accusation, not with sympathy, but with the expression of a man who is updating his understanding of a situation. Then he nodded once, quietly, and rode after the others. The storm raged for 2 days and 2 nights. On the first evening, a family arrived at the mill on foot, Marguerite and Claude Pro from the creek bend, their 3 children bundled in whatever they could find, their own house having lost its chimney in the first hour of the storm. Dinah brought them inside without hesitation. She wrapped the children in the wool flannel that had been intended for them 11 years ago, heated water on the mill stove, and fed them from the salt pork and flour in the relief stores. They sat close to the fire, and the children slept. By the second morning, 4 more families had come through the drifts. The Abbotts from the South Road, a widow named Gear with her elderly father, 2 young men from a logging camp caught between Harwick and nowhere. Dinah organized the space, opened crates methodically, distributed what was needed. She dressed a cut on a child's hand with the iodine and bandage linen from the medical stores. She kept the fire and she kept count, and she kept calm. The mill held them all. On the second afternoon, a single rider arrived. His horse pushed harder than was kind, a gray-bearded man in a government-issue coat who had been caught on the road between Weirton and Harwick and had followed the mill's lantern light down from the ridge. He introduced himself as Stuart Beam, provincial land surveyor, and he was grateful for the soup. Later, when the families around the fire had settled and the wind had dropped to a low continuous howl, Dinah set the oilcloth bundle on the table in front of Stuart Beam and said, "I think you need to look at this." He read slowly and carefully, the way a man reads when he understands that what is in front of him is going to change a great many things. He went through both ledgers twice. He examined the Department of the Interior seal on the oilcloth wrapper, which was still fully legible. He looked at the dispersal columns with their 11 years of blank lines. He looked at the signature at the bottom of each page. He said nothing for a long time. When the storm broke on the third morning, Stuart Beam rode to Harwick ahead of the thaw. What followed is the slower, more formal kind of justice that doesn't translate easily to a fireside, careful and procedural and full of language that moves at its own pace. But here is what we can tell you. The ledgers and stores were received by the Department of the Interior within the fortnight, and the matter was referred to a provincial inquiry before the first snowfall of December. Alderman Thaddeus Crisp resigned from the Grey County Council in November. The inquiry, which ran through the following spring, found that the relief goods had been deliberately withheld and the distribution falsified, and that Crisp had used the period of provincial confusion following the Grey Winter to acquire 2 of the 3 farms that had failed that season at below-market prices from families who had never received the provisions that might have saved them. The families named in the ledger received formal acknowledgement from the province. Some received compensation. Several recovered debts that had been weighing on them for over a decade. And in the spring of 1890, when the frost left the ground and Barrow Creek ran high and clear with the melt, a group of men from those same families came up the mill road with tools and timber. They cleared the mill race in 4 days, working in the particular easy rhythm of people who have chosen to show up without being asked. They replaced the damaged paddles on the wheel. They helped Dinah and Reed rebuild the north wall, course by course, using proper lime mortar that would hold against 20 Ontario winters. The Fenchurch mill turned its wheel for the first time, in 11 years on a Wednesday in May, with the youngest, Garnet boy, sitting on the fence watching and Burr barking enthusiastically at the water spray, as though he had predicted this all along and was gratified to have been proven right. Dinah ran the mill through that first summer. She was not a miller by training, but she had a bookbinder's instinct for understanding how systems hold together. The way tension must be properly distributed, the way each component depends on the ones beside it, the way patience applied at the right moment does more than force applied at the wrong one. She learned what she didn't know from Reed Maddock, who had concluded, somewhere in the course of that long winter, that he did not particularly want to live 4 miles from the Fenchurch mill any longer. They did not call it Dinah's Folly in Harwick. They called it the Fenchurch, as they always had, but the word carried different weight now. A mill with flour to give, a lantern kept in the window through the long months, a yard where the children ran in the evenings without being told to go home. That is a different kind of landmark than a ruin. One evening in late summer, Dinah and Reed sat on the stone wall at the edge of the mill yard, watching the light go gold and long across the valley. Burr was asleep with his chin on Dinah's boot. The creek murmured below the weir. From somewhere inside the mill house came the smell of baking bread and the distant sound of the children arguing cheerfully about something that didn't need to be argued about. Reed picked up the bone folder from where it had been sitting on the wall beside her hand. He turned it over once, feeling the worn, smooth surface of it, then set it back down without comment. "What did you think you were doing?" he said quietly, "when you put your hand up in that square?" Dinah looked at the mill, at the wheel turning slowly in the evening current, at the light in the loft window where the raccoons used to live and the Garnet boy now sat reading whenever he could get away with it. She thought of $12, of a dead man's tool in her coat pocket, of a government lock on a door that nobody had opened in 11 years. "I thought I was buying somewhere to sleep," she said. She picked up the bone folder and turned it once in her fingers. The way she had turned it the morning of the auction. The way she had turned it on the night she found the ledgers. The way she had been turning it for 6 years. Renwick told me it would tell me when a thing was worth saving. She looked at the mill, at the creek, at the light. I think it was right. We wonder tonight if you have ever held on to something that everyone else said had no value, and found out later how wrong they were. Tell us in the comments, wherever you're watching from across this country. We'll see you next time.